September 5th, 1548. Inside the dim chamber of Sudeley Castle, Catherine Parr writhed in the grip of childbirth fever. Sweat beaded across her pale skin, her breaths shallow, her body burning as the disease consumed her. Only 6 days earlier, she had cradled her newborn daughter with trembling joy. Now, the last wife of Henry VIII, the queen who had survived his rage and his court of blood, faced the one enemy she could not escape: death at 36. In the summer of 1512, in the market town of Kendal in northern England, a daughter was born into the Parr family. Her name was Catherine, and though her parents could not have imagined it, she would one day wear the crown of England, step carefully across the most dangerous court in Europe, and die in a manner as common and cruel as any village woman. From her first breath, Catherine's life was marked not by privilege of birth, but by the strange weight of intellect, a gift that would set her apart and eventually place her in mortal danger. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, was a knight with connections at court, respected but hardly among the great magnates of the realm. Her mother, Maud Green, came from a lineage of service and faith. Theirs was a house of modest nobility, a family not destined to produce queens, but perhaps governors, courtiers, and loyal servants of the Tudors. Yet in the Parr household, something unusual stirred. A belief that learning was not only for sons. Catherine, along with her siblings, was taught to read and write, and more, to think. This was an age when most noblewomen were prepared not for books, but for households, not for scholarship, but for obedience. Catherine, however, grew up surrounded by tutors and by her mother's insistence that daughters could match sons in the life of the mind. She absorbed languages quickly, mastering Latin, then French, and later Italian. These tongues gave her access to scripture, to philosophy, and to a Europe brimming with religious change. At a time when Henry VIII himself was just beginning to question Rome's power, young Catherine was already sharpening her mind on texts that stretched far beyond the borders of England. Imagine the girl in her chamber, a slim figure, hair the color of autumn wheat, bent over a manuscript while candlelight trembled on the page. Outside, the northern wind battered the stone walls of Kendal Castle. But within, Catherine's world was a tapestry of words and meanings. She read the Psalms. She puzzled over theology. She copied Latin phrases in careful strokes. Where her contemporaries practiced music or embroidery, Catherine trained her mind, building a fortress of learning that would one day become both her crown and her curse. Her mother's ambition for her was not limited to scholarship. Lady Maud understood that, in Tudor England, knowledge alone could not protect a daughter. Marriage was the crucible through which every noblewoman was tested. Still, she allowed Catherine to dream of more, of a life where intellect and faith could matter. Perhaps, in the quiet corners of her childhood, Catherine imagined herself as more than a wife, more than a pawn in family alliances. Perhaps she saw herself as a voice, but history rarely permits such visions to women. By the time she reached adolescence, Catherine was already being prepared for her first arranged marriage. Even so, her learning gave her a composure rare among her peers. Courtiers noticed her ability to speak, not just with politeness, but with substance. She could discuss scripture with men of the cloth, converse in French with ambassadors, and still charm in the dances of noble households. Her mind made her luminous, and in the Tudor world, to shine too brightly was always dangerous. It is worth pausing here at the threshold of her adulthood to consider the irony. Catherine Parr would be remembered as the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, a survivor among the fallen queens. Yet her true legacy was forged long before she met the king. In an England where women's voices were muted, she dared to read, to write, to publish. She stood at the edge of the Reformation with eyes wide open, understanding the peril of ideas in a kingdom where ideas could kill. And yet, in those early years, there was still innocence, still hope. Catherine's letters reveal a girl earnest in faith, devoted to family, eager to serve. She was not the fiery rebel of later years, nor the cautious diplomat of Henry's court. She was simply a young woman of unusual depth, stepping into a world that would test her spirit at every turn. The historian John Fox would later describe her as a woman of singular learning and knowledge. Others called her the Queen Scholar. These titles trace back to the girl who once sat by a narrow window, listening to the wind whistle through Kendal, her mind reaching toward realms far beyond. She could not know that her learning would one day make her suspect in the eyes of her husband, the king. She could not know that her pen would nearly deliver her to the scaffold. She could not know that, for all her brilliance, she would be remembered not for what she wrote, but for how she died. The seeds of tragedy were planted in her childhood. To be a woman who thought, who questioned, who published, this was to walk a knife's edge in Tudor England. Catherine Parr's story begins not with marriage, nor with coronation, but with a book in her hands and the dangerous notion that her voice mattered. It was this voice that would carry her to the throne, that would nearly bring her to ruin, and that would finally echo in her writings long after her body had turned to dust. Her journey had begun. The queen of intellect, the survivor of kings, was still only a child, unaware that the very gift her family had nurtured would one day demand the ultimate price. In Tudor England, marriage was not a promise of love. It was a contract, a calculation, a chess move in a world where women were pawns and queens were sometimes sacrificed. For Catherine Parr, her youth was not spent chasing romance, but fulfilling the duties laid before her by family and circumstance. Before she ever touched the crown, she wore the veil of a bride twice, each time stepping into households where affection was rare and survival was uncertain. Her first marriage came in her teenage years, to Edward Burrough. He was not a powerful magnate nor a glittering courtier, but the scion of a Lincolnshire family tied to the gentry. For Catherine, this union offered stability and position. Though hardly glamour, she was still little more than a girl, and yet her fate was already bound to a man nearly twice her age. In the cold halls of the Burrough estate, she learned the quiet duties of a wife: to manage a household, to offer obedience, to preserve her family's honor. But even as she fulfilled her role, life reminded her of its fragility. Edward was sickly, his health failing with each passing year. Catherine's marriage, brief and overshadowed by illness, left her a widow before she was 21. The vows she had spoken with solemn resolve ended not with betrayal or scandal, but with death. Already she understood how quickly the ground beneath a woman's life could shift, how little control she held over her own future. Widowhood gave her a strange kind of freedom, but it was a freedom bound in mourning clothes. For a noble woman in Tudor England, there was no space for independence. A widow could not rule her own fate for long. Families, allies, and kings themselves found uses for women like Catherine. Her second marriage was arranged soon after, this time to John Neville, Lord Latimer, a man decades her senior, a veteran of court politics, and a figure of influence in the turbulent North. Latimer's home was a world apart from the modest halls of the Burroughs. His estates carried weight. His family had deep ties to the crown. Yet the marriage placed Catherine once again in a role that was less companion than caretaker. She was young. He was aging. She was a student of scripture and philosophy. He was a man seasoned by power and caution. Their union was respectable, and in its own way, stable. But it was not a partnership of equals. Still, Catherine proved herself more than dutiful. She became mistress of a large household, navigating the complex loyalties of servants and tenants, managing estates stretched thin by political unrest. The north of England in those years was restless. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a great rebellion against Henry VIII's break with Rome, had shaken the region. Latimer himself had once been suspected of sympathies with the rebels, and the family lived under the shadow of royal suspicion. Catherine's daily life was colored not only by the management of lands, but by the constant hum of political danger. In these years, she honed the skills that would one day serve her as queen. She learned patience, diplomacy, the art of survival in households divided by faith and loyalty. She witnessed how quickly fortune could turn. A rumor, a betrayal, a single misstep could bring ruin. Her intellect, once cultivated in the quiet of Kendal, was now sharpened by the necessities of power. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned how to soothe tempers, to maintain alliances, to cloak her own beliefs in prudence. And yet, there was a personal toll. Catherine was still a young woman, but her life was already shaped by the needs and frailties of older men. Love, as most understood it, seemed a luxury beyond her reach. Instead, she poured her energy into faith and study, finding solace in the written word. Books became her constant companions, their pages offering glimpses of a world larger than the walls that enclosed her. Through them, she nurtured a selfhood that no marriage could fully erase. When Lord Latimer died in 1543, Catherine was left widowed for a second time. She was not yet 31, but she had already buried 2 husbands. The experience etched lines of sorrow and endurance into her character. Where other women might have retreated into obscurity, Catherine emerged with a reputation. Learned, pious, dependable. She was known in court circles not for scandal, but for substance. It was in this moment of transition, a widow once more, wealthy now, but vulnerable in her independence, that her path intersected with destiny. She caught the eye not only of courtiers, but of the king himself. Henry VIII, bloated with age and scarred by years of power and paranoia, sought a new wife. The throne of England, littered with the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, beckoned Catherine Parr. Her previous marriages had been arranged by duty, dictated by circumstance. Now, she faced a choice that was no choice at all. To deny Henry was impossible. To accept him was to step into a cage gilded with blood. Catherine's education, her patience, her resilience, all had prepared her for this moment, though none could shield her from the dangers it would bring. Her chain of marriages had not been forged by passion, but by survival. Each husband had shaped her into something harder, something wiser, something more enduring. The girl who once read by candlelight in Kendal was now a woman tempered by loss and duty. The widow of Edward Burrough and John Neville would soon be the wife of a king. It is easy from a distance to view these marriages as stepping stones to the crown. But for Catherine, they were crucibles, each one burning away illusions, teaching her that to live in Tudor England was to live at the mercy of forces far greater than love. She had survived 2 husbands. She would now face the 3rd, and with him, the shadow of death itself. By the spring of 1543, Henry VIII was an old man in everything but years. He was only 51, yet time had ravaged him. His once athletic frame, the pride of jousts and hunts, had swollen with gout and gluttony. His leg, long infected from a jousting accident, oozed painfully and left him foul-tempered. Courtiers learned to measure their words around him, for the king's anger was sudden and often lethal. This was the man who had discarded or executed 5 wives. And yet, in this season of decline, he set his sights on Catherine Parr. It was not beauty that drew him. Catherine was neither the dazzling figure of Anne Boleyn nor the tragic youth of Catherine Howard. She was 31, older than most brides of kings, with auburn hair, soft brown eyes, and a composure that came from years of widowhood. What Henry sought now was not passion, but comfort. He needed a consort who could manage his household, tend to his children, and soothe his volatile temper. He needed a nurse, a companion, perhaps even a balm for a conscience scarred by broken vows. Catherine Parr, educated, diplomatic, deeply pious, seemed to him the perfect choice. For Catherine, the proposal was no less than a command. She was in love at the time with Thomas Seymour, the dashing brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour. She might have chosen him had fate been kinder. But when a king asks for your hand, refusal is not an option. Catherine, once again a widow, found herself bound to a 3rd husband, the most dangerous of them all. On July 12, 1543, she became the 6th wife of Henry VIII. The wedding was held quietly at Hampton Court Palace. Attended by a handful of courtiers, there was no grandeur, no public jubilation, only the solemn acknowledgement that England had a new queen. Yet behind the ceremony lay a silent question that haunted everyone present. How long would she last? Life as Henry's wife was a daily performance on a stage of fear. Catherine understood better than anyone the stakes. She walked the corridors lined with the memories of queens who had died there. Anne Boleyn, once radiant, had been beheaded in the Tower. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, had followed her to the block. Even Jane Seymour, beloved and saintly, had perished in childbed. Each had been replaced in turn, each erased in the service of Henry's will. To marry Henry was not simply to wear a crown, it was to gamble one's life against his temper. Yet Catherine brought something unique to the role: intellect. She was not content to remain silent or ornamental. She took charge of the royal household with efficiency, proving herself a capable administrator. She gathered scholars and theologians, surrounding herself with minds eager to debate the questions of the age: scripture, reform, the meaning of faith. For a time, Henry seemed to relish her company. He valued her as a conversational partner, a woman who could read Latin with him, who could soothe him with gentle reasoning. But in the Tudor court, intellect was a double-edged sword. Catherine's influence soon extended to Henry's children. She worked to reconcile the king with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both been declared illegitimate in the wake of their mother's disgrace. With patience and persuasion, Catherine brought them back into Henry's favor, restoring them to the line of succession. It was a remarkable act of diplomacy and a gamble that risked Henry's wrath. But in this, she succeeded, shaping the future of England more than she could ever know. Without her intervention, Elizabeth might never have become queen. Still, danger was constant. Catherine's religious sympathies leaned toward the reformist side, aligning with those who sought to push England further away from Rome. She encouraged the translation of scripture. She read Protestant writers, and she even published a devotional book under her own name. To her supporters, she was a beacon of learning and faith. To her enemies, she was a heretic waiting to be condemned. At court, whispers gathered like smoke. Could it be that the queen was plotting against the king's soul? Henry's health worsened. His temper grew more violent, his paranoia sharper. In this atmosphere, Catherine's very brilliance threatened her survival. One slip of the tongue, one careless debate, could bring her to the scaffold. She lived each day with the memory of the axe that had fallen on Anne and Catherine Howard. She knew that love could not save her, nor piety, nor duty. Only her wits stood between her and destruction. And yet, in spite of the ever-present danger, Catherine carved a space of dignity for herself. She acted as regent when Henry campaigned in France, overseeing the kingdom in his absence, a rare honor for a queen consort. She showed herself not only capable of managing the household, but of governing. She stood at the crossroads of power and peril, embodying both the strength and the vulnerability of women at Henry's court. But each night, when the palace grew silent, Catherine must have wondered, how long can this last? She had been twice widowed already. She had seen friends fall to the executioner's blade. Now she slept beside a man whose love had always been conditional, whose anger was legendary, whose health was failing fast. To be Henry's sixth wife was to live with ghosts. They hovered at her shoulder, reminding her that survival was never guaranteed. For the moment, she wore the crown. For the moment, she was safe. But in the Tudor world, safety was fleeting. Catherine Parr had stepped into the role of queen with eyes wide open. She knew the dangers, she knew the cost. What she could not know was that her greatest trial would not come from Henry's wrath, but from the silent enemy that awaited her years later. The fever that would strike her down in childbed and turn her survival into tragedy. By 1546, the Tudor court was a battlefield of faith. On one side stood conservatives loyal to the old ways, eager to preserve ties to Rome's traditions. On the other side, reformers whispered of scripture in English, of a church unshackled from papal chains. In the middle sat Henry VIII, a king who had broken with Rome but who remained mercurial, capable of swinging between leniency and fury with terrifying speed. And at his side, as queen, was Catherine Parr, a woman whose mind and tongue had carried her farther than most dared to go. Catherine had always been drawn to ideas of reform. The scriptures she read, the devotionals she wrote, the theologians she consulted, all bore the flavor of Protestant thought. She believed in the importance of reading the Bible in one's own language, in understanding faith not just through priests, but through personal reflection. These were dangerous beliefs in a realm where accusations of heresy could still bring a queen to the scaffold. Yet Catherine was not content to keep silent. She debated openly with Henry himself, challenging him on matters of theology, citing scripture with a confidence that startled even the king. At first, Henry tolerated it. Perhaps he even found it amusing, his learned wife crossing swords with him in the intimacy of their chambers. But as his health declined, his patience waned. By 1546, Henry was plagued with ulcers, crippled by pain. His mood a tempest no courtier dared to predict. When Catherine pressed him too hard in one debate, his face flushed with rage. It was then that her enemies saw their chance. The conservatives at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, had long viewed Catherine as a threat. Her influence over the king, her leanings toward reform, her writings under her own name, all marked her as a woman who wielded too much power. Now they whispered poison into Henry's ear. The queen, they suggested, was not only opinionated, she was dangerous. She was teaching heresy. She was plotting against him. Henry listened, grim and brooding. The same hand that had signed death warrants for Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard could be turned against this wife as well. By midsummer, the trap was nearly set. A warrant for Catherine's arrest was drawn up, accusing her of heresy. The Queen herself was unaware, but others in her household began to sense danger. One evening, as she prepared for bed, a loyal servant overheard the king's men discussing the warrant. Breathless, she brought the news to Catherine. In that instant, the Queen understood. The scaffold was calling her name. What followed was a display of the very skill that had carried Catherine through years of peril. Instead of panicking, she turned to her pen and her voice. She crafted a plan not of defiance, but of surrender, a performance of humility designed to soothe the king's wrath. The next day, she sought Henry out, her eyes lowered, her voice soft. She told him she had only ever spoken of religion to divert him from his pain. She was but a woman, she insisted, unworthy to teach, but eager to learn. If she had dared to debate him, it was only to give him comfort, to make him forget his suffering. Her words, carefully chosen, wrapped the king's fury in silk. Henry, suspicious but flattered, softened. "Not so, Kate," he said, according to later accounts. "You are a doctor, Kate, to instruct us." The crisis, for the moment, was over. The warrant lay waiting, but Henry had changed his mind. Catherine had survived, not by force, not by allies, but by the quicksilver strength of her intellect and her humility. The next day, however, her enemies tried once more. Wriothesley himself arrived at the Queen's chambers with soldiers in tow, ready to seize her. But Henry, who had already reconciled with his wife, lashed out in fury. "Knave!" he roared at Wriothesley. "Begone with your insolence!" The men retreated, humiliated. Catherine Parr, for the second time in her life, had stood inches from death and walked away untouched. But the experience left its mark. From that moment, Catherine understood how fragile her position truly was. She might wear the crown, she might even hold the king's affection, but her life hung by a thread of Henry's moods and the ambitions of her rivals. To be queen consort was to live in the shadow of death, every word weighed, every gesture scrutinized, every thought potentially fatal. Even so, Catherine did not retreat entirely into silence. Her devotional writings continued, her influence over the king's children deepened, and her quiet support for reformers endured. But she learned to cloak her convictions in careful diplomacy, to wield her pen with discretion, to debate with tenderness rather than sharpness. The fire of her mind had not dimmed. It had merely been hidden under the ash of caution. This near arrest in 1546 was more than a personal brush with death. It was a revelation of the Tudor court's nature. Power there was not a gift, but a trap. One misstep could undo years of careful balance. Catherine's survival did not mean she was safe. It meant only that she had bought time. The axe that had fallen on other queens remained forever close, its shadow stretching across her days. In the quiet of her chambers, Catherine must have reflected on the irony. She, who had once been a girl reading scripture by candlelight in Kendal, was now a queen pleading for her life with the very man she had dared to love as a teacher. Her survival was not triumph, but reprieve, a fragile pause in a court that consumed women as swiftly as it crowned them. She had endured, but endurance was not victory. And as Henry's health declined further, as the succession loomed, as the factions at court sharpened their knives, Catherine Parr would discover that survival was only the beginning of her tragedy. The Tudor dynasty in the 1540s was less a family than a battlefield. Henry VIII had 6 wives, 3 children, and a kingdom still reeling from his break with Rome. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had both been declared illegitimate at different times. His only son, Edward, frail and often ill, was the hope of the dynasty, but the weakest thread in its tapestry. Around them swirled factions of courtiers, eager to exploit every rift. In this fractured landscape, Catherine Parr emerged not only as queen, but as mediator, a healer of wounds cut by their father's ambition and wrath. From the moment she entered the royal household, Catherine saw clearly what others ignored: that Henry's legacy depended not only on power, but on unity. If his children remained divided, the realm would fracture with them. If they could be reconciled, England might endure beyond his reign. With patience, tact, and the quiet persistence of a woman accustomed to walking on glass, she set about the impossible task of bringing them together. Mary, Henry's eldest, was proud, stubborn, and deeply Catholic. She bore the scars of her mother, Catherine of Aragon's, humiliation. Declared a bastard after her parents' marriage was annulled, forced to serve her infant half-sister Elizabeth in childhood, she carried bitterness that no royal title could erase. To Mary, every woman who replaced her mother was a usurper, every reform a betrayal of faith. Winning her trust would require more than kind words. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was sharp, precocious, and wary. She had been only 3 when her mother was beheaded. Yet the memory of that shame shadowed her entire life. Declared illegitimate after Anne's fall, she grew up in a liminal space, royal by blood, yet tainted by scandal. Elizabeth learned early to mask her feelings, to listen more than speak, to calculate every gesture. Catherine Parr recognized herself in this girl, a survivor in the making. And then there was Edward. Born to Jane Seymour, the only wife Henry had publicly mourned, Edward was fragile, a child cloistered by physicians and tutors. Precious to his father, he was also prey to factions who saw in him a chance to seize influence. Catherine took to him not only as queen, but as stepmother, nurturing him with affection that came naturally after years of caring for sickly husbands and complex households. It was in this role, stepmother, that Catherine Parr shone most brightly. She gathered the 3 children at court, encouraging them to dine together, to share lessons, to see themselves not as rivals, but as kin. She gave them books, guided their studies, and fostered a love of learning that would later define Elizabeth's reign. In evenings, she read with them, translating scripture and history, turning the royal household into a classroom of unity. What Catherine achieved was nothing less than extraordinary. For the first time in years, the royal children began to see one another not merely as heirs of competing mothers, but as siblings. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, the future of England, sat at the same table, under the same roof, guided by the steady hand of their stepmother. Catherine did not erase the scars of Henry's cruelty, but she showed his children that they shared more than pain. They shared a lineage, a destiny. Her influence extended further. Catherine pressed Henry to reconsider the line of succession. By her persistence, both Mary and Elizabeth were restored to their places after Edward, an act that secured the possibility of Elizabeth's eventual reign. In an age where daughters were so easily cast aside, Catherine's diplomacy ensured that England would one day be ruled by one of its greatest monarchs. Without her, Elizabeth I may never have worn the crown. But Catherine's work was not only political, it was deeply personal. She offered the children something their father never could: stability. In her presence, they found gentleness, consistency, and maternal care. Mary, long hardened by humiliation, softened under Catherine's respect. Elizabeth, sharp and suspicious, blossomed under her encouragement. Edward, frail and lonely, thrived in her attention. The Queen had managed what no law or proclamation could accomplish. She had given the Tudors a semblance of family. Of course, the court never ceased its whispering. To the conservatives, Catherine was meddling in matters beyond her station. To the reformists, she was not radical enough. Yet Catherine, in her quiet resilience, refused to be drawn fully to either side. Her aim was not to win factional battles, but to preserve a dynasty. She stood at the heart of the storm, shielding the children as best she could from the tempests of their father's reign. It was during these years that Catherine also revealed another side of her legacy, her voice as an author. In 1545, she published Prayers or Meditations, a devotional book under her own name. This was unprecedented. No English queen had ever published before. To hold a book bearing a woman's name, a queen's name, was a radical act in itself. In the preface, she described the work as a tool for spiritual reflection, a guide for the faithful. Yet beneath its pages lay a declaration that a woman, even within the suffocating grip of Tudor patriarchy, could write, could think, could be heard. Henry allowed the publication, perhaps seeing in it a harmless outlet for his wife's restless mind. But others did not. To Catherine's enemies, her writings were further proof of her reformist leanings, a sign that she sought to shape England's soul in ways that threatened tradition. Once again, she walked a knife's edge, her pen as dangerous as a sword. Yet she persisted, believing that faith was too vital to be silenced, that her position as queen demanded more than silence and obedience. Through it all, the queen's health remained steady, her spirit seemingly unbreakable. She had survived 2 husbands, endured Henry's moods, and faced down near arrest. She had given England more than a caretaker. She had given it hope. But beneath her triumphs lay the same truth that shadowed every Tudor woman. Her life was not her own. The future could not be controlled, no matter how carefully she played her part. And as Henry's death approached, Catherine's carefully balanced world would collapse once again. For the moment, she was the healer of the Tudors, the queen who had turned a broken family into something resembling a dynasty. But even healers cannot cure the sickness of fate. Catherine Parr had mended what she could. Soon, she would discover that her own wounds would never heal. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the kingdom he left behind was a fragile edifice of power, wealth, and wounds. His son, Edward VI, just 9 years old, was declared king, but the realm was to be ruled in his name by regents. Courtiers scrambled for position, alliances shifted overnight, and the throne itself seemed a prize in a dangerous game. Amid this storm, Catherine Parr, now 35, widowed for the 3rd time, found herself free. For the first time in decades, she could choose her own path. And in that fragile window, she chose love. The man was Thomas Seymour, younger brother of Jane Seymour, the late queen who had borne Henry's only son. Unlike his elder brother, Edward Seymour, who quickly claimed the title of Lord Protector and became the most powerful man in England, Thomas was ambitious but restless, reckless even. He was handsome, with charm that drew women to him, and an energy that made him both exciting and dangerous. Catherine had known him for years, and before Henry's proposal, she had felt the stirrings of affection for him. Now, with Henry gone, the possibility of a union built on more than politics seemed at hand. Their marriage was swift and secret. In May 1547, only a few months after Henry's death, Catherine wed Thomas Seymour in her private chapel. To some, it was scandalous, indecently quick, a betrayal of her late husband's memory, even an insult to the crown. Yet Catherine, who had endured 3 loveless marriages, could hardly be blamed for seizing happiness when it appeared. For the first time in her life, she had married not for duty, but for desire. The newlyweds took up residence at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. For Catherine, the castle became more than a household. It became a sanctuary. After years of walking on eggshells in Henry's court, she could finally breathe, laugh, and love freely. She reveled in the small joys of domestic life, walking the gardens, sharing meals without ceremony, speaking with her husband not as subject and sovereign, but as equals. It was a happiness that felt fragile, almost unreal, as though fate itself might snatch it away. But even in her moment of peace, shadows gathered. Thomas Seymour's ambition burned as brightly as his affection. Watching his elder brother Edward wield power as Lord Protector gnawed at him. He wanted influence. He wanted status. He wanted more. Catherine, ever patient, counseled moderation, urging him to remember that ambition unchecked could lead to ruin. Yet Thomas was not a man easily restrained. His charm could turn careless, his boldness reckless. The marriage also placed Catherine in the awkward position of stepmother once more, this time to a girl who would one day be queen. The young Elizabeth, now 14, came to live in Catherine's household. The Queen Dowager took her in with affection, treating her not as a rival, but as a daughter. She provided her with tutors, guided her studies, and gave her a safe home away from court intrigues. In Catherine's company, Elizabeth flourished. She learned not only languages and history, but the subtler arts of diplomacy and survival. The lessons Catherine offered would shape the young princess into the monarch she would one day become. Yet beneath this domestic harmony ran currents of tension. Rumors began to swirl about Thomas Seymour's behavior with Elizabeth. Some said he entered her chambers early in the morning, jesting and wrestling with the girl in ways that raised eyebrows. Others whispered of Catherine's discomfort, torn between love for her husband and concern for Elizabeth's honor. Whether these stories were exaggerated by enemies or grounded in truth, they left a stain that history would never wash away. Catherine, however, remained steadfast. She removed Elizabeth from her household, perhaps to quell gossip, perhaps to protect both girl and husband. It was an act of painful necessity, one that revealed Catherine's instinct to shield others, even at the cost of her own happiness. Despite the unease, Catherine's marriage to Thomas was not without joy. In the spring of 1548, to her surprise, she discovered she was pregnant. At 36, after decades of childless unions, she was to become a mother. For Catherine, this was a gift long delayed, proof that she could finally have not only love, but family. In letters, she spoke with quiet hope of the child to come, of the life she would build with Thomas and the infant. Pregnancy, however, was perilous in the 16th century, especially for a woman of Catherine's age. Physicians had little knowledge of infection, no remedies for complications, no tools beyond prayer and herbal tinctures. Still, Catherine prepared with courage. She arranged her household at Sudeley for the birth, surrounded herself with attendants, and prayed for strength. In the quiet halls of the castle, she must have dreamed of holding her child, of raising a daughter or son who would carry on her legacy of learning and faith. For once, it seemed that happiness was within her grasp. She had survived Henry's tyranny. She had outmaneuvered her enemies at court. She had brought healing to a fractured family. Now she had love, and soon she would have a child. Yet history's cruelty is often greatest in its timing. Just as Catherine Parr reached for joy, fate reached back with its cold hand. Her love for Thomas, real though it was, would not save her. Her long-awaited child would not be the blessing she imagined. In the very chambers of Sudeley Castle, where she had laughed and prayed, Catherine would soon face her final agony. For now, though, she allowed herself to hope. The summer of 1548 was filled with anticipation. The gardens alive with flowers, the castle alive with preparations for the coming birth. Catherine herself radiant in her expectancy. She had been queen, wife, widow, scholar, and healer. At last, she was to be a mother. It was a role she had longed for, and one that destiny would allow her, but only briefly, before tragedy struck its final blow. By 1548, Catherine Parr was 36 years old. In Tudor England, that was an age when most women had already borne several children. Many did not survive so long. For Catherine, whose 3 earlier marriages had been childless, the discovery of pregnancy came as both miracle and risk. At last, she would hold in her arms a child of her own blood. Yet the physicians, midwives, and even her attendants knew what Catherine surely felt in her bones. That childbirth, at her age, was a gamble against death itself. The news spread quickly through Sudeley Castle. Servants whispered of it with awe, courtiers spoke of it with calculation. A queen dowager, once consort to Henry VIII, now expecting an heir with Thomas Seymour. It was more than a private joy. It was a statement of power. A child of Catherine and Thomas might claim a place in the dangerous game of succession. A figure with Tudor blood by affinity, Seymour ambition by birth. Politics clung to the unborn infant like a shadow. But Catherine, weary of factional strife, wanted only the simple happiness denied her in so many years of duty. For once, she could dream of being more than a queen, more than a wife bound by politics. She could dream of being a mother. The summer months passed in a haze of anticipation. Sudeley Castle became the stage for preparations. Tapestries freshened, chambers appointed, midwives consulted, physicians summoned. Catherine herself, though heavy with child, continued her habit of reading and writing, keeping her mind as alive as her body was burdened. She composed prayers, reflected on scripture, and spoke often of her hopes for the child's future. "God grant me strength," she is said to have murmured, "that I may raise this child in faith and wisdom." But she knew the danger. Every noble woman did. Childbirth was called a woman's death, the threshold where life and mortality met in a contest that no rank could soften. Even queens had fallen in their chambers. Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, had died in childbed scarcely a decade earlier. Catherine had watched that tragedy unfold and now faced the same peril. At night, in the silence of her chamber, she must have wondered whether her learning, her wit, her survival of kings and politics would mean anything when faced with the agony of labor. Thomas Seymour, for all his ambition, was attentive in these months. He fussed over her diet, arranged for her comfort, and spoke with pride of the child they would soon welcome. His restless eyes, usually fixed on schemes and advancement, softened when they fell on Catherine. To her, he must have seemed both husband and hope, a partner at last chosen for affection rather than duty. Yet even in his devotion, whispers lingered. Some courtiers muttered that Thomas saw in the child another rung in his climb toward power. Perhaps he did. But Catherine, in her gentle resilience, focused on love rather than suspicion. She had lived too long in fear. She wanted, in these last months, to believe in joy. As her pregnancy advanced, Catherine withdrew more and more from public life. The court in London carried on its intrigues, but Sudeley remained a quiet world apart. Visitors came, noblewomen to offer their company, clergy to pray for her safe delivery, physicians to monitor her condition. Still, Catherine must have felt the loneliness of anticipation. Few could share her burden, fewer still her apprehension. In her solitude, she turned again to her faith. The Psalms became her companions, her prayers growing longer, more urgent, as the hour of labor drew near. One can imagine her walking slowly through the castle gardens in the long summer evenings, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, her face lit by the fading sun. She had carried so many burdens in her life: widowhood, politics, the crown itself. And now she carried the most fragile of all, new life. To those who saw her then, she seemed serene. But serenity in Tudor England was often a mask. Behind her calm eyes, Catherine surely knew the truth, that joy and death walked hand in hand where childbirth was concerned. By late August, the castle braced itself. Midwives prepared linens, basins, and swaddling clothes. Physicians sharpened their quills to record the outcome. The household prayed. Catherine herself was confined to her chamber, as custom dictated, surrounded by women, separated from the world of men until the child was born. The room was darkened, perfumed with herbs to ward off illness, filled with crucifixes and prayer books. In that chamber, Catherine faced the ancient trial of her sex, a trial no crown could exempt her from. On August 30th, 1548, the moment arrived. Labor seized her body in waves of pain that no learning could master, no title could ease. For hours she endured, gripping sheets, whispering prayers, her face pale with exhaustion. The women around her murmured encouragement, the midwives guided her, the physicians hovered helplessly. And at last, the cries of a newborn filled the chamber. A daughter, Mary Seymour, lay swaddled in cloth, placed in her mother's trembling arms. Catherine, drenched in sweat, her body racked with exhaustion, looked upon the infant with a joy both radiant and fragile. For a fleeting instant, it seemed that fate had relented. She had her child, her long-awaited blessing. Her joy, however, was tempered by weariness. The strain of labor had left her weak, trembling, vulnerable. Still, she smiled, whispering words of gratitude, cradling the infant as though the years of sorrow had been redeemed in this single moment of new life. But joy in Tudor England was always shadowed. In the hours after the birth, Catherine began to feel chills. Her body burned with fever, her skin clammy with sweat. The midwives exchanged anxious glances. The physicians whispered of imbalance, of humors turned foul. In truth, they faced a specter they could not name: puerperal fever, the invisible infection that haunted birthing chambers across Europe. Catherine's victory in childbirth would soon become the prelude to her greatest defeat. The castle rejoiced at the infant's birth. But within the Queen Dowager's chamber, joy had already begun to sour. The fever's grip was tightening. Catherine Parr, who had survived Henry VIII, who had healed the Tudor family, who had dared to publish under her own name, was now in the grasp of an enemy she could not reason with, could not outwit. The scholar queen had given life, and in doing so, she had placed her own life in peril. The shadow of tragedy was drawing close. The cries of a newborn echoed through the stone halls of Sudeley Castle on the morning of August 30th, 1548. For the first time in her 36 years, Catherine Parr held in her arms a child of her own body. The infant was a girl, named Mary Seymour. And for a fleeting instant, Catherine felt the kind of happiness that had so long eluded her, the warm, fragile joy of motherhood. Those who stood in the chamber described the Queen Dowager's face as radiant despite her exhaustion, her smile trembling yet profound as she whispered prayers of thanksgiving. The room itself was thick with the sense of childbirth. Sweat, herbs, candle wax. Midwives moved quietly about, cleaning linens, tending to the child, while Catherine lay propped on pillows, her hair damp with perspiration, her body limp from hours of labor. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, entered briefly to behold his daughter, pride in his eyes. He kissed Catherine's hand, perhaps genuinely tender, perhaps already dreaming of the influence this child might someday bring. Then he departed, leaving his wife in the company of women and whispers. At first, all seemed well. Catherine was weak, but she was alive. The child was small, but she breathed and fed. In those first hours, the chamber carried the soft hum of satisfaction. Yet even then, danger was present, invisible but relentless. Within the blood and the tearing of childbirth lurked the unseen threat of infection. No one in that room knew of germs, of hygiene, of the importance of clean hands. The midwives and physicians did what tradition prescribed, but their very touch may have sown the seeds of death. By the second day, Catherine began to feel a strange chill. Her body, once hot from exertion, now shivered uncontrollably. She clutched at her sheets, teeth rattling, even as sweat poured from her brow. Soon came the fever, waves of heat that left her gasping for breath, her pulse racing, her skin flushed. At first, the attendants called it exhaustion, a normal weakness after delivery. But Catherine, who had seen other women succumb in childbed, recognized the signs. She knew what was coming: puerperal fever, the scourge of mothers, the silent killer of queens and peasants alike. It had claimed countless women in silence, striking without warning, advancing with merciless speed. There was no cure, no salve, no prayer strong enough to halt it. Catherine, the scholar queen, must have understood that her learning, her piety, even her crown could not shield her now. Still, she fought to remain composed. When attendants pressed cool cloths to her forehead, she thanked them with a faint smile. When her daughter was placed in her arms, she kissed the infant's soft brow, whispering, "God keep you." But the fever gnawed at her body. Her abdomen swelled with pain, her head pounded with delirium, her voice grew hoarse. The Queen Dowager of England, who had survived Henry VIII, who had published under her own name, who had guided princes and princesses, now lay broken by a foe as common as it was cruel. Outside her chamber, Sudeley Castle celebrated the birth. Servants spoke of the Seymour line strengthened, of the joy of new life. Few grasped that within those darkened walls, joy was already giving way to tragedy. Thomas Seymour, restless as ever, rode to court on business, leaving his wife to her attendants. His ambition could not be slowed by illness, even hers. Catherine, abandoned to her fever, whispered bitter words. "My lord has given me cause to die." It was a lament not only of neglect, but of betrayal, that the man she had married for love had left her in her most desperate hour. By the fourth day, the fever raged without mercy. Catherine's mind clouded with delirium, her words scattered. Sometimes she spoke to the child she could barely hold. Sometimes she raved against shadows on the wall. Sometimes she prayed, clinging to verses she had memorized in her youth. The attendants tried poultices, bleeding, charms, all the medieval arsenal, but nothing slowed the march of infection. Her body was failing. The women in her chamber wept quietly, for they had seen it before. They knew how this story ended. A mother bore a child, then slipped into fever, then silence. Nobility meant nothing here. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, was no different from the farmer's wife, the baker's daughter, the countless women buried without record. The same fate claimed them all. In the brief moments of lucidity that remained, Catherine spoke of her faith. She declared her trust in God's mercy, even as her body betrayed her. She asked for prayers for her daughter, the infant Mary, whose life without a mother would be fraught with peril. She confessed her fears, her regrets, her unspoken sorrows. The scholar who had once written prayers for others now lived them in her own agony. Her attendants recorded that she was restless, that she tossed in her bed, that her moans echoed through the chamber at night. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath. The woman who had mended the broken Tudor family, who had survived the axe of Henry's wrath, who had published words that defied silence, now lay consumed by a fever no power could undo. On the 6th day, the fever reached its peak. Catherine, drenched in sweat, whispered one last prayer. Her voice was faint, her body weak, her spirit worn thin. She was 36 years old, and she had given life. But in giving life, she was losing her own. The tragedy of Catherine Parr was not only that she died, it was that she died in the most ordinary of ways. A queen undone by the same peril that claimed countless nameless women. Her survival of kings, her triumphs of intellect, her courage in the face of politics, all ended in the bed of a mother, shivering with fever, clutching sheets with hands that could no longer hold her child. The scholar queen, the healer of the Tudors, the last wife of Henry VIII, undone by childbirth. On the morning of September 5th, 1548, the bells of Sudeley Castle remained silent. No triumph, no anthem of birth. Only the muffled footsteps of attendants pacing outside a chamber where the Queen Dowager of England lay dying. 6 days had passed since the birth of her daughter, Mary Seymour. 6 days of fever, of delirium, of pain that no prayer could soothe. The woman who had once matched Henry VIII word for word in theology, who had published devotions in her own name, was now reduced to whispers and broken gasps. Her attendants later recorded the sound of her voice, low, strained, incoherent. At times she spoke of her husband Thomas Seymour, her words edged with bitterness. "My lord has left me," she muttered, as though even in her last hours she felt abandoned. At other times she prayed, repeating fragments of the Psalms she had memorized as a girl. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Between verses, she cried out in anguish, her body seized by waves of heat and shivering cold. Those who stood by her bed could do nothing. Midwives cooled her brow with damp cloths. Physicians, powerless, recommended the same remedies that had failed countless others. Bloodletting, herbal infusions, fumigations of rosemary and sage. They did not know, could not know, that the invisible hands of bacteria were consuming her from within. To them, her fever was divine judgment, a test of spirit. To Catherine, it was torment. Through the fever, her mind drifted in and out of clarity. Sometimes she recognized her daughter, placed carefully in her arms for a fleeting moment. Her lips touched the child's forehead, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "God keep you, my little one." At other times, she raved, accusing shadows on the walls of betrayal. The scholar queen was dissolving into fragments of memory and delirium. The attendants, hardened by experience, knew the signs. The end was near. On the night of September 4th, her condition worsened. Her breathing grew shallow, her body convulsed with fever. The women in the room lit more candles, their flames trembling in the heavy air. The castle outside lay hushed, the corridors empty, as though the entire world held its breath. In those hours, Catherine spoke her last coherent words, turning once more to prayer. "As for me and my house," she murmured, "we will serve the Lord." Then her voice faded, her eyes closing as though in surrender. When dawn came on September 5th, Catherine Parr breathed her last. She was 36 years old, a queen who had survived Henry VIII, outmaneuvered his wrath, healed his broken family, and written words that would outlive her. Yet she died not in glory, but in silence, a victim of the same peril that claimed countless women of her time. No crown, no learning, no faith could spare her from the hand of puerperal fever. Her death was quiet, almost unnoticed beyond the walls of Sudeley. There was no state funeral, no procession through London's streets, no tolling of bells across the realm. The court, consumed by its own intrigues, moved on quickly. Thomas Seymour grieved briefly before returning to his ambitions at court. Her infant daughter, Mary Seymour, was left in the care of others, an orphan from the day of her birth. Catherine's passing was not marked by grandeur, but by absence. Yet for those who had known her, the loss was profound. She had been more than Henry's sixth wife. She had been a scholar, a mediator, a woman of courage and intellect in a world that punished both. She had walked the razor's edge of Tudor politics and emerged with her head intact. She had shaped the futures of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, planting seeds that would grow into England's destiny. But her final chapter was written not by politics, but by biology, the relentless, ordinary cruelty of infection. Her body was laid to rest at Sudeley Castle in the chapel of St. Mary. There, beneath the vaulted stone, her attendants wept as her coffin was lowered into the earth. The inscription remembered her as Queen Dowager, but history would later shrink her to a footnote, the wife who survived Henry VIII. It was a cruel irony, for in truth, she had not survived at all. She had merely outlived him, only to be undone by the peril of motherhood. The funeral was modest. Bishops intoned prayers, courtiers bowed their heads, and the candles flickered against the cold stone walls. Outside, autumn winds swept across the Cotswold Hills, carrying with them the final breath of summer. Within, the Queen's voice was silenced, her presence reduced to memory. For her infant daughter, the tragedy deepened. Mary Seymour, scarcely days old at her mother's death, would not live to remember her. Within a year, the child too would vanish from history, dying young, her body lost to the records of time. Catherine's legacy as a mother, so long desired, was erased almost as soon as it began. What remains then of Catherine Parr? Not the pomp of coronation, not the triumph of politics, but the image of a woman in a darkened chamber, struggling for breath, clinging to life, whispering prayers as fever consumed her. Her death was ordinary in its cause, extraordinary in its tragedy. For here was a queen who had faced Henry VIII and lived, who had walked among the most dangerous men of her age, only to be struck down by the oldest foe of women. 6 days. That was the span between joy and despair, between motherhood and mortality. 6 days in which Catherine Parr cradled her child, whispered her prayers, and surrendered to the fever that would not release her. 6 days that defined the forgotten tragedy of a woman remembered too simply as the survivor. But survivors, too, die. Catherine Parr's story did not end with her death at Sudeley Castle. The child she left behind, Mary Seymour, barely outlived her. Records suggest the infant died before her second birthday, vanishing into silence before she could speak her mother's name. Thus, the queen who longed for family left no living descendants. Her line ended almost before it began. And yet, Catherine's true legacy lay elsewhere. She was the quiet architect of Tudor stability, the woman who reconciled Henry with his daughters, ensuring that Mary and Elizabeth stood once more in the line of succession. Without Catherine, Elizabeth's reign, the golden age of England, might never have been possible. In her published prayers and meditations, she also left a voice preserved in ink. The first English queen to print under her own name, daring to speak in an age that silenced women. Her life, though marked by tragedy, was also marked by endurance. She survived Henry not by accident, but by wisdom, by patience, by an instinct for survival sharpened through years of duty. And though her death was painfully ordinary, the same fate that claimed countless mothers across Tudor England, it was precisely this ordinariness that makes her story so piercing. Catherine reminds us that queens and commoners shared the same fragile humanity, the same perils of childbirth, the same vulnerability before fate. She was not just Henry's last wife. She was a scholar, a mediator, a woman who tried to stitch together a family torn by power. Her life ended too soon, but her influence rippled outward, shaping the future of a dynasty. Catherine Parr's final lesson is simple and enduring. Survival is never triumph, but even in tragedy, there can be meaning.